Have you ever looked at a building and just thought, how? Like, not just how did they put the bricks together, but how did that even pop into someone's brain? Well, today, we're diving deep into a building that looks less like it was designed and more like it crash-landed. I'm talking about a shimmering, metallic creature that looks like it washed up on the banks of a rusty, forgotten river in northern Spain. This, my friends, is the incredible story of the Guggenheim Bilbao. It's a building that was flat out declared impossible to construct. It was slammed by the public as a colossal waste of money for a city that was literally on the brink of total collapse. And yet, somehow, against all odds, it ended up changing, well, everything. Not just the city, not just the world of architecture, but the very way we think about the power of a single, radical idea. It's a story about art, for sure, but it's also a story about fighter jet software, decommissioned Soviet submarines, and what is essentially a very, very expensive potato chip. All right, so here's the game plan for today. First, we're going to tackle the building itself, this so-called impossible building. Then we'll hit rewind and look at the city that took this insane gamble. After that, we'll get into the nerdy stuff, the secret tech that actually made this thing buildable, Gehry's digital fish. Then we'll witness the shocking success, this thing that became known as the Bilbao effect. And finally, we'll ask the tough question. Is this amazing story a blueprint for success or a dangerous myth? Let's get into it. So first up, an impossible building. Let's start with the object itself. Because before this was some famous economic case study, the Guggenheim Bilbao was just a profound architectural mystery. You got to picture the world it was born into, right? The 80s and early 90s, architecture was kind of dominated by two things. Either buildings that looked like they were trying to be old Roman temples, or these really rigid corporate glass boxes. Everything was very serious, very straight-lined. And then, this thing shows up. I mean, just look at it. Yeah, it's made of solid stuff, titanium, glass, limestone, but it really looks like it's made of light and motion. It's got these surfaces that just ripple and twist, and they seem to completely defy gravity. Now, the genius here is that it was designed to capture the notoriously gray, overcast skies of Bilbao, and through some kind of architectural magic, turn them into this warm, shimmering gold. It doesn't just sit next to the river, it feels like it crawled out of it, like some massive metallic fish arching its back. It's a building that truly never looks the same way twice. From one angle, yeah, it's a ship, a nod to the city's industrial past. But from another, it's like a flower, unfolding these giant metallic petals. It's totally chaotic, but somehow it's incredibly beautiful. From the very beginning, people basically hated this idea. You had two main camps of naysayers. First, you had the engineers and the builders, the practical, nuts and bolts people. They looked at the sketches and the little models and just said, nope, absolutely not, this is unbuildable. They said you couldn't possibly create normal blueprints for something with these kinds of curves. But the second camp, they were even louder. They said even if you could build it, you absolutely shouldn't. To them, it was an absurdly expensive, totally irresponsible gamble for a city that was, at that exact moment, in the middle of a devastating crisis. They saw it as an alien spaceship landing in a junkyard, a total slap in the face to the thousands of workers who just lost their jobs. And yet, the second it opened its doors in 1997, the entire conversation just flipped on its head. The legendary architect Philip Johnson, and you have to understand, this guy was the kingmaker of 20th century architecture, the man who basically defined what was cool for decades. He flew in, took one look at it, and declared it to be this: the greatest building of our generation. Coming from him, that wasn't just high praise, that was a verdict. The building was instantly, globally hailed as an absolute masterpiece. Which brings us to the big question that hangs over this entire story. How on earth did this impossible, controversial object end up here, of all places? To really get the building, you have to get the city. And let me tell you, in the 1980s, Bilbao's reality was unbelievably bleak. This was not a tourist hotspot. People often called it one of the ugliest, most polluted cities in Europe. It was the heartland of the Basque Country's Industrial Revolution, a proud city of steel and ships. But that was the past. By the 80s, that legacy had turned into a post-industrial nightmare. We're talking about a city covered in a permanent gray smog from smokestacks, where the river was so choked with industrial waste it was literally biologically dead. It was a place you drove through, not a place you visited. And this picture, this says it all. This was the spot they chose for the museum. It was a landscape of rust, of abandoned shipyards and collapsing warehouses. This city had powered Spain for a century, but when cheaper global competition came along, its main industries just collapsed. The engine died. And all that was left was the decay, the pollution, and this deep, deep sense of hopelessness. People said the air smelled like sulfur. This wasn't just a city in decline, it felt like a city at the very end of its life. The statistics from back then tell a truly grim story. Entire shipyards, which were the lifeblood of the community for generations, were just shuttered. Unemployment for the whole region was around 25%, and in the hardest-hit neighborhoods, it was over 35%. Now, that's not just an economic statistic. That is a social catastrophe. It means an entire generation of young people with zero future. The city was socially, environmentally, and economically in total ruin, known more for street protests and clashes with riot police than for literally anything else. The future looked like it just wasn't going to happen. So in this atmosphere of just absolute desperation, the Basque regional government decided they had to do something, anything. They knew they couldn't restart the steel mills or reopen the shipyards. That world was gone. They needed a new plan, and they made a gamble that was so audacious it bordered on complete insanity. They approached the Guggenheim Foundation in New York with an unbelievable offer. They basically said, we, the Basque government, will pay for everything. We will give you $100 million to build a world-class museum by a world-class architect right here in our dying industrial city. We'll even pay you a $20 million fee just for your name and your art. We'll cover the annual budget. You just have to show up. And the officials were brutally honest about why. This was never really about culture. It was an economic Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort to shock the city system back to life. So you can probably imagine how this went over with the public. Spending that much taxpayer money on a fancy American art museum while a quarter of the population was out of work was, well, let's just say it was controversial. The project was met with widespread, furious protests. People saw it as a ridiculous vanity project for politicians, completely disconnected from the reality of their lives. They needed jobs, not giant sculptures. It felt like the government was building a palace in the middle of a famine. The anger was real, and it was loud. The whole project seemed doomed from the start, not just by the technical challenges, but by the massive weight of public opposition. Okay, so how exactly did they plan to build their way out of this mess? By choosing a design so radical, so complex, that it only made their gamble seem even crazier. They didn't pick a safe, boring design that would blend in. No, they chose a design that was guaranteed to provoke, to challenge, and to be incredibly, terrifyingly difficult to build. They chose chaos. They chose Frank Gehry. Now, Frank Gehry wasn't some unknown architect. He was already famous for being a bit of a rebel, known for his wild sculptural forms and his use of weird materials like chain link fence. But Bilbao was on another level entirely. For years, he had been obsessed with the movement of fish. Seriously, he saw in their fluid, powerful motion an energy and a life that he felt was missing from static, boring buildings. His design process was super hands-on. He didn't start on a computer. He started with these chaotic, energetic sketches, and then moved to building dozens and dozens of handmade models out of paper and wood, constantly twisting and reshaping them with his hands, until they just felt right. The shape came from intuition, not from a formula. Okay, to understand the huge challenge here, you have to think like a potato chip. No, I'm serious. A Pringle. See, almost every building in human history is Euclidean. That means they're made of flat planes and straight lines. Walls, floors, roofs. They're easy to draw on a piece of paper with a ruler. But Gehry's design was non-Euclidean. It was a world of complex, compound curves. Just like a Pringle, its surfaces curve in more than one direction at the exact same time. Now imagine trying to tell a steelworker how to cut a beam to perfectly match the edge of that Pringle. You can't. You simply cannot represent that kind of shape accurately in a traditional 2D blueprint. This was the fundamental problem. Gehry had this beautiful shape in his hands, but absolutely no way to translate it into instructions for the people who had to actually build it. So, how do you build the unbuildable? Well, you borrow a secret weapon from the French aerospace industry. This is CATIA, which stands for Computer-Aided Three-Dimensional Interactive Application. It was this super powerful 3D modeling software developed to design Mirage fighter jets. It was literally created to map the complex aerodynamic curves of a jet wing, curves that, just like Gehry's, were impossible to draw in 2D. So Gehry's team took his little handmade models, scanned them with a 3D digitizer, and boom, they had a perfect, mathematically precise digital model of the entire building. The software basically demystified the impossible shapes. It could tell a stonemason the exact unique shape of every single piece of limestone. It could tell a steel fabricator the precise curve of every single structural beam. It was a total revolution. This was one of the very first times a building was built this way, directly from a 3D digital model. The building's iconic look, that shimmering skin, also came down to an incredible stroke of pure luck. Gehry knew he wanted a metal skin, but stainless steel just looked dead and flat in Bilbao's gray light. But he had this small sample of titanium hanging outside his studio, and he noticed how it seemed to absorb the quality of the light, glowing with this warm, golden life even on the darkest days. It was the perfect material. But it was astronomically expensive. The budget screamed no. And then, a geopolitical miracle. The Cold War ends, and Russia starts decommissioning its fleet of Alpha-class submarines, the fastest, deepest diving subs ever made, with hulls made entirely of, you guessed it, titanium. Suddenly, the global market was flooded with cheap surplus Russian titanium. The price crashed so hard that for a brief moment in time, titanium actually became cheaper than stainless steel. They bought everything they needed right at the bottom of the market. The impossible material suddenly became the budget-friendly option. So, against all the technical odds, against all the public opposition, against all the budgetary logic, the impossible building was built. And not only was it built, but it was completed on time and on budget, which for a project this complex is a whole other miracle. And its impact, well, it was bigger, faster, and more profound than even its most optimistic supporters could have ever dreamed of. The world showed up, and it was absolutely stunned. The museum's success was so immediate and so totally transformational that it literally created a new term in urban planning and economics, the Bilbao effect. It became the global shorthand for this idea of cultural-led regeneration. The theory goes like this. You build one spectacular, iconic building. It attracts tourists, the tourists spend money, new businesses spring up, the city's whole image is transformed, and this virtuous cycle of investment and growth just takes off. Bilbao became the poster child for this strategy, the ultimate proof that it could actually work. And the numbers are just stunning. The most optimistic business plan hoped for maybe 400,000 visitors in the first year. That was their benchmark for success. In reality, they got nearly 1.4 million. They more than tripled their wildest dreams. In the first 3 years alone, nearly 4 million tourists visited the museum, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity. And these weren't just people from the next town over. These were people flying in from New York, Tokyo, London, specifically to see this building in this once-forgotten city. The economic return was almost immediate. The entire initial investment was paid back through new tax revenues within just a few years. And the effect keeps going. The museum still pulls in around 1 million visitors a year and continues to pump hundreds of millions into the local economy annually. It created thousands of jobs, not just in the museum, but in all the hotels, restaurants, and shops that sprung up around it. It kicked off a complete regeneration of the entire riverfront. It single-handedly transformed Bilbao from a rusty industrial relic into a thriving, confident, global tourist destination. It didn't just save the city's economy, it gave the city its pride back. It put Bilbao on the map. So, it sounds like a perfect fairy tale, doesn't it? A dying city is saved by a single, beautiful building. The ugly duckling transforms into a swan. It's the ultimate proof that visionary architecture can solve real-world problems. But is the Bilbao effect really a magic formula that any city can just copy and paste? As the story became a global phenomenon, we have to look at the other, much more complicated side of this beautiful story. To see the controversy, we have to go right back to the beginning. This entire transformation, this globally celebrated success story, was driven by a decision made completely against the overwhelming will of the people it was supposed to help. Let's be real. If you would put this project to a public referendum in 1991 with unemployment at 25%, it would have been crushed in a landslide. Not even close. So the whole thing was born from a profoundly undemocratic process. And what's crazy is that the officials behind the project, they're totally upfront about this. They don't shy away from it at all. Their argument is basically that sometimes, to achieve great things, leaders have to ignore short-term public opinion and trust their own long-term vision. That sometimes the public doesn't know what's best for it. Now, that is a really provocative argument. It pits the idea of bold, visionary leadership against the fundamental principles of democracy. And it raises a deeply uncomfortable question. What if they were right? Does the incredible success justify the means they used to achieve it? And this right here is the biggest danger. The success became a dangerously oversimplified recipe for politicians and city planners all over the world. The lesson they took wasn't about careful, integrated urban planning, political courage, and a unique economic context. The lesson they took was hire a famous architect, build a wacky-looking building, and wait for the tourist money to roll in. This sparked a global frenzy of cities trying to create their own Bilbao effect, often with disastrous results.
They commissioned these expensive architectural trophies that ended up sitting empty, completely disconnected from the city's actual needs, because they'd ignored all the other, less glamorous work that made Bilbao a success, like the new subway system, cleaning the river, the whole redevelopment plan. They wanted the miracle without doing the hard work.
So in the end, we're left with this powerful and really complicated legacy. On one hand, you have a city that was truly reborn, and you have undeniably one of the greatest and most influential buildings of the 20th century, a triumph of art, technology, and just sheer audacity. But on the other hand, we're left with a really challenging question about what it all means. Is the Bilbao story a one-of-a-kind miracle, a perfect storm of the right architect, in the right city, at the right time, with a heavy dose of Cold War luck? Or is it a replicable blueprint for the future of our cities? And maybe more importantly, what's the real price of a miracle? The conversation, as you can probably tell, is definitely not over yet. Look, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the story of Bilbao and you find this stuff as fascinating as I do, then you're going to want to stick around. Make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button for the Just Necessary Design channel. We unpack more surprising stories just like this one about the things we build and, more importantly, why they matter. Don't miss out, and be sure to check the description for a link to download free resources about everything we talked about today. Thanks for hanging out.